Well, it gives me enormous pleasure now to introduce Michael Rosen to talk to us. How do you introduce a former children's laureate and someone who's written more than 200 books? Well, I love this. I'm looking on stuff to do with Michael, and I particularly like the quote that spending time with the former children's laureate has a nostalgic air of a private lesson with your favourite teacher. Michael, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Setting myself up here. The plan was that I would speak straight after this without referring to it, but hopefully we can leave some time to talk if you want to talk about the film or ask me questions and so on. So let me begin really by talking about this word creativity that we throw about, which is fine. I mean, I'm somebody who throws it about and uses it quite a lot, and that's fine. But if we ask ourselves, we can often ask ourselves, what is creativity? But maybe an easier and better way of talking about it is, what does creativity involve? What activities are involved when we're being creative? So I thought I'd inject a bit of creativity, if you like, a bit of definitions into the argument this evening by saying, well, what is it that is involved when we're being creative? So I'm going to run through some things. If you want to jot them down to kind of chew over, do feel free. I won't be offended if you've got a pencil and paper in your hand. And it's a sort of checklist, really. So if you are teachers or in any way involved in young people, it's a sort of checklist that you can use. That's the reason why I've done it. To ask yourself whether this activity, am I in some way or another engaged in creativity? So it's really a sort of checklist for you to use. So one of the first things, let's go to the word itself. Creativity, of course, is linked to creation, and you don't have to be particularly religious to know that the one idea at the core of creation is that we make something new. So we know the phrase creation myths, we know the phrase the creation from the Christian Bible, and also, of course, what's in the Christian Bible about the creation is also a Jewish story about Adam and Eve. And so, of course, in that story, God creates the world, creates all the animals, creates Adam and Eve, and so on. So there's this idea in create of something new. So let's hang on to that idea of newness, that something new happens when we're being creative. So we're not doing exactly the same thing as we did yesterday, last year. Those of us who had the kind of education I had, we've had quite a familiar sight. There was a teacher sitting in front of us at some of these crusty old grammar schools like the one I went to, with teachers reading notes to us that were actually yellow with age. And then we went to university and it was repeated. So they were actually doing exactly nothing new. They were just going through something that they'd been doing year on year. And indeed, my dear dad, who was a very creative person, my dad, but one of the things he had to do was supervise students going into schools. And he remembers sitting in a staff room and coming back telling me this story, and how a teacher came in. It's not me slagging off teachers, I promise you, but it was my dad being slightly amused. The teacher came back and said, one of these grammar schools, and said, well, I've taught it to them. Whether they know it or not is another matter. And I remember my dad sort of keeling over and laughing and me not understanding the joke. And me saying, well, what's the joke? And he said, well, what's the idea of teaching if you don't know whether they've learnt anything? And me thinking, well, isn't that what teaching is? I mean, I've had that for the last 5 years at the school that you sent me to. But anyway, we often used to have those kind of conversations, me and my dad. So the opposite of newness, if you like, is if we find ourselves doing the same thing over and over again. So now, seemingly in complete contradiction to that, is that what is very often involved in creativity, perhaps always, is a form of borrowing. So how can we hold those two ideas in our head, newness and borrowing? Another way of putting it is continuity and change. And they are crucial because to a certain extent, nothing that we create in this world is ever completely new. We use the bits and pieces, the ready-mades, the already made, the moving parts, as one person put it, of the past, whether we're being creative in science or the arts, whether it's in literature or pottery, whatever it is, you can never escape what's been there before. Even if you're dealing with language, the whole of language Though we can be new with it, it's a new poem, it's made with the ready-mades of the language that we have. So even the most original poets, let's say somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins or Edward Lear or somebody like that, they are actually working with the sounds, the shapes of the language as it's been before. You can never start from somewhere that is nowhere. So that raises always an interesting question, that how do we resource creativity? So I'll come back to that, because I think that's a crucial question to ask. What do we do? What's the environment we create in our classrooms and schools? How do we create what we might call a laboratory for creativity? Okay, so I use that word laboratory deliberately, because another aspect of creativity is being experimental. Now, you will know, but those of you who are teachers, that doing experiments, trying things out, has been squeezed. You saw at the end of the film a conversation a bit there about the national curriculum. I was just reminiscing, I was being interviewed by a lady from the BBC, I think, and the word experimental came up. And we found ourselves recollecting, my youngest is just about to turn 18, and I'm recollecting his science education, 5 years at secondary school. And I did ask him, did you do any experiments in the 5 years that you did science? And he said, well, I can't think of any, Dad, no. And I thought, oh, right, that seems a bit of a shame. And then, of course, suddenly I got a flashback to a thing where he came home and said, can you help me with my science revision? It's extraction of metals from rock. And I said, yeah, okay, let's do it. Open up your book, you see. And then I said, what was, this was much earlier, I said, what was the experiment? And he said, we didn't do an experiment. I said, well, how did you find out about, getting metal out? He said, well, we just did the worksheet, Dad. And I said, oh, right, so let's have a show me the worksheet. So he showed me the worksheet, and in the corner was a picture of a thing that looked like a potato. And underneath it said, ore. And I said, did you have any ore in the classroom? Did you handle anything? Did you sort of have a bit of rock that had a little twinkly bit in it that, No. Well, not at all. No. So you didn't know what ore was, because I said, that to me, that looks like a potato. And he said, no, look, Dad, could you not waste my time going on about you ranting on your usual crap? Could you not do that, Dad? Because I've got to learn this. Look, it says there's 3 kinds of ways of extracting metals: electrolysis. So I said, well, the only way I know how to do that, I said, is you take a plain piece of paper, okay, and then you cover it up like that, and you go, there are 3 ways to get metal out of it. Yeah, that's right. There's 3 ways to get, is electrolysis, no, I can't remember the second one, like that. I said, it's the only way I know, and then you'll know all there is to know about. Anyway, there we are, experiment. So what is experiment? It's, to my mind, it's trial and error. And the issue for me in schools is whether it's trial and error with or without a sense of failure. All right? Without a fear of failure. Because for me, a great dampener on anything creative is the idea that you can fail, or that indeed, as we know, that is built into the exam system, that a third will fail. Okay? So whatever we do in the world of creativity, whether it's in science or the arts, can we factor in the possibility that you can't be wrong? You can only be right in different ways. Is it possible to factor that in? So I'm throwing that out as an idea, because anybody who is, whether they're an artist or a creative scientist, that's what I'm going to make myself part of that community, that's the elbow room we give ourselves, so that we can take risks without worrying that we're going to fall off the cliff, or that some big bad other thing is going to come along and go, not good enough. Whoever is this deus ex machina, that whoever it is that is going to come in and wreck your life because you're wrong as you're making this pot or tinkering around with a Bunsen burner and a bit of ore, if only. So that's to me very, very important. So this business of experiment is absolutely crucial. And of course, if an experiment is what I might call authentic and real, then built into it is the idea of the possible. In other words, as you experiment, you don't know what will be the outcome. If you're set up a situation in which you've told all the students what is the outcome, well, there ain't much point in doing it. So somewhere in the experiment, you have to factor in that the people doing it, and whether it's writing a poem or sitting with a Bunsen burner and a test tube, is that you don't actually know what will fully happen. You might have a good idea it will happen, and if it doesn't happen, then that will be as interesting as if it doesn't happen. So the idea of possibility is crucial, and then following off the back of that, the idea of change, that you are going to be a participant in change, or even, let's hope, an agent in change. Now this is really, really important to my mind, because a lot of the curriculum doesn't involve any of this stuff. There is no sense of possibility, no sense that things might change as you're doing it, all right, or that you are an agent in it. So just to take one example that is one of my bugbears is the grammar curriculum at primary school. We're told that language is this fixed thing, and that when there is something on the page, that it is that. It is a noun, or it is a determiner, or whatever they say it is. In actual fact, of course, they change their mind, and then 3 weeks later they say, oh no, actually it's a definite article, it's not a determiner. And then somebody comes along and says, yeah, but a definite article is a determiner, and we think we're taking children with us. But it is, that's what they try and tell you. Not that it might be, or that you could experiment, or that you could divvy up language in different ways. Indeed, I've mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins. There's somebody who played with language so that any word that he had in his hand, he could change it and move it and make it a verb or a noun or an adjective or an adverb, and whichever way he wanted to. He never knew, probably. He just enjoyed playing with it. So the crucial thing is change, and here's a little slogan for you. I think it comes from a man called Mr. Marx, which is that in changing nature, we change ourselves. So when we use the word nature there, it doesn't just mean sort of trees, it means anything outside of myself. So it's a different word, it's a kind of material word meaning the material world. So in changing anything outside of ourself, in the act of changing it, we change ourselves. So this to me is very, very crucial part of creativity, that we experience change. Another example that came from just before we were talking, I love telly, I watch lots of telly, but the thing about telly is that it's very hard to experience change through watching it. I quite like watching programs that are about people being creative, like during lockdown there were these wonderful programs about Grace and Perry and getting people to do wonderful paintings. He was with his wife Philippa Perry and so on, and his daughter, and they were doing wonderful things, and wife and I were watching it, but actually I was sitting on my bum on the sofa doing absolutely nothing. It's very nice, but I wasn't experimenting, I wasn't trial and erroring, I was going, yeah, great, yeah, good old Grayson, yeah, great guy, which is fine, it's absolutely fine, it's all right. I'm not going to say it was wrong of me to do it, but whatever it wasn't me being an agent in the process of change, because I wasn't being creative other than just interpreting the images, which in its own way is mildly creative, but I wasn't doing what all those people were doing on the screen, which really was going through changing experiences and changing themselves, reflecting on who they were and so on. So that brings us to the next buzzword I'm going to use, which is interpretation, interpretive. So of course, when you're engaged in the arts, when you're engaged in any form of creativity, science or arts, you are involved in a form of interpretation. So let me just give you an example of how that fares in our society. So probably most of us at one time or another have been to what's called a stately home. So we've walked into these stately homes, and then there are these bloody great big pictures, massive pictures all over the walls, on the ceiling. In fact, you're supposed to now I've got a mic in my neck. What is that there? What are they, angels or fairies? What are they? What is that, a swan? Is that a story? And you flick open your catalogue thing and you go, oh, it's Leda and the Swan, is it? Or is it The Rape of the Sabine Women? Or is it both? And you sit there, oh no, that's the other panel. I thought, oh no, isn't that Joseph of Arimathea or something, isn't it? No, anyway, I don't know. So the walls are covered with this stuff. And of course, this is if you want to place it in terms of prestige, this is the highest status of art that was thought of at the time. So nearly always these great stately homes, 18th century, 19th century, and these were the richest people in the world, richest people in the country anyway, but often in the world, and they wanted to surround themselves with high status things they could think of. So they then brought in the most celebrated artists they could find and said, paint wonderful things, mostly in the glory of me, but if you find some other things, then that would be nice. And it's sort of, I get a bit of reflected glory from them anyway. And so they did it. So this was the highest status thing you could do, which was to interpret stories from usually, well, a mixture of the Bible and classical stories from Rome and Greece, you see. So here was high status. Now consider, let's jump forwards and come and stand in, let's say, a secondary school or a primary school, and think of the status for somebody doing that. So that would be someone in the art room finding a story, let's say Harry Potter, you know, anything at all, but finding Harry Potter and doing a picture of how they would see a scene from Harry Potter, Dumbledore or something, or whatever, yeah, and doing a picture. What sort of status is that? Well, the answer is it's very low status. Particularly if that person doesn't go on to do GCSE or A-level. It's got virtually no status whatsoever in most state schools. And then if you flip that into writing or science or wherever, that kind of interpretive activity has very low status. High status in the writing world, at any rate, which I can speak about, but also in other parts, is knowledge about, because that's what they brought in with the knowledge-rich curriculum. So that's high status. So if you know the knowledge about music, or the knowledge about art, or the knowledge about Shakespeare, or something like that, and then you can do either a mixture of comprehension or writing essays, that's high status in education. So somewhere along the line, we've demoted interpretation. I've never seen anything that's ever explained how, when, and why, and where that demotion took place. And in fact, if you go into private schools, big, large, what we call public schools, ironically, but you go into those schools, in actual fact, you find that that artistic work is high status. You walk in, and I only know because, by and large, I don't perform in private schools, except when they bring in state schools, and so I have a little snoop. And I wander about, snooping, and it's amazing. These big public schools, they have like a music block. What? They have a whole building that is the music block. And then they go over there and then they have a theatre. Oh, really? Do you know, you've got theatre as well as a music block. Oh, yeah, come and see our art block and have a see our potter's wheel. And so you think, well, what's going on? What a strange thing going on in which these top public schools have got these fantastic arts facilities. I mean, they're like here, you know, they're like galleries and theatre spaces and so on. And in state schools, it's low status, squashed out by, in secondary schools, by things like EBAC and Progress 9, or I sometimes get it muddled, is it E9 and Progress Back? I never know, but anyway, squashed out because those are the terms in which schools are evaluated, in which they're graded and so on, and put up in the league tables. And so there's two things going on here in which it's high status in one place and low status in another. So though I said in the past it was high status and present it isn't, I've now qualified that. So I'm very interested in this role for the arts and creativity to be interpretive, because it's some error that we've invented that the only way to be interpretive is to do what I'm doing now, which is to be analytic. I mean, there's a role for being analytic. I mean, look, I'm doing it. I've got notes here in front of me. It's fine. But, you know, there's also a role, a very important role, for us to interpret other forms of art, other forms of reality, whatever. Excuse me. So that's what I'm defending, is the role for that it should be of equal status alongside analysis. Yeah. Already touched on the idea that, of course, that the arts are reflective. If we give them space, and if we give creativity space, people will reflect. In fact, I'll give you an example from science. I had a wonderful biology teacher at this fusty grammar school, a wonderful, wonderful biology teacher who would often ask us to devise experiments. And once we had discovered that plants produce chlorophyll, so we had a bit of knowledge, a bit of borrowing, if you like, a bit of knowledge, and that if you covered up the leaves of the plants, then the plant would go white. And so somebody said, and it wasn't me, they said, could you do cut out initials and put them on a leaf, so you would end up with the leaves with your initials on. And she said, well, I don't know, try. And so that's what we did. We did it, bunged them in the cupboard, all that sort of thing. And then halfway through, somebody said, hang on a minute. You know, because in those days we used to have films in our cameras, and we had something called negatives. Yes, some of you will remember. Some of you won't. You have no idea what I'm talking about. But anyway, there were little plastic sheets that were the negative of the positive pictures. Yes? And somebody said, well, I've got negative. If we put a negative of a portrait of me on the leaf, could we in actual fact make a photograph on a geranium leaf? And she said, I don't know whether that would work. So we did that as well, and it worked. So some of us were putting our initials on, so it was kind of egotism wrapped with science, which is brilliant. But she very carefully sort of pretended she didn't know. I mean, she probably had quite a good idea how it would work out, but she was genuinely curious as to whether the negative one would work. And sure enough, there was a little picture of us on the geranium leaf, and it worked by stuffing the geranium in the cupboard, as I seem to remember. And so there's an example of the way in which we could then reflect on that and think about how it was that that worked and how it was that the chlorophyll was or wasn't affected by this, that, or other. So, you know, it spreads right the way across. I don't know whether you know the story of how Volta, Mr. Alessandro Volta, discovered that electricity was not just purely inside animals, but it could actually be conducted through metal. Do you know that story? Oh, well, it's amazing. Because up until Volta came along, they thought that electricity was only immanent in animals. You know, they'd got frogs twitching and things like that. And in fact, they had a word for it. I think they used to call it animus or something like that. But anyway, don't hold me to that. Anyway, he started experimenting, and his experiment was that he put a bit of foil in his mouth, and he managed to get electricity to be conducted through the foil in his mouth because he felt it tingle. So he got a charge going through because he used the saliva. But it was through playing with metal and in a saline-y sort of solution, namely his own saliva, that he discovered that you could conduct electricity through metal. Look it up. It's a lovely story about a top scientist making a major discovery that has affected the world by mucking around with a bit of tin foil, or the equivalent of it. Now, another aspect of creativity that is crucial for a lot of it, not all of it, is that it may well involve empathy. So this is a crucial aspect of our existence. I mean, if we don't think about the other, then we're actually doomed. I mean, governments make enormous efforts not to think about the other, and they've brought about some of the worst and awful crises for the human race. Think of the middle of the last century. But they also do it now. They're doing it right now. I mean, if I might be political for a moment, I mean, to conceive of the Rwanda scheme involves a particular kind of insensitivity, a particular kind of not putting myself in the shoes of the other in order to pursue it. And even when faced with people saying, do you know what this means? Do you know that these people will go to a country where you have no jurisdiction? Do you know there is a civil war going on in the northern part of that country? Do you know that these people more often than not are coming from places where they are in fact terrorized by war and persecution? That in order to put that outside of their view, they are in fact refusing empathy. But the arts, but also creativity in science, you know, does require us to at least begin to think about other people, putting yourselves in the shoes of the other. I'm not going to say it makes you a better person, but we do rely on it for the survival of the human race. So it's crucial that we do it. And so an engagement with thinking about the other, or indeed to think about what it means to other people. I mean, I know that sounds tautological, but you know, there's a great man called Edward Said who wrote a book called Orientalism, which in actual fact draws our attention to the ease with which human beings can other people and make them inferior, less desirable, less interesting, less intelligent. The speed and ease with which we do that we need to do the opposite and work in the opposite direction and not say that the other is inferior. I mean, there's an old Christian thing, do as you would be done by. In fact, there's even a character, isn't there, in one of the Charles Kingsley books, Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By, in The Water Babies, I think, if I remember rightly, which, you know, in its own way is a great little axiom. You know, do as you would be done by. Why should you do to others any differently from what you would do to yourself, or you would hope that others would do to you? If we operated like that in the world, it would be a very different place. And in fact, creativity, particularly in the worlds where you are empathizing, and it's very easy to factor it in writing, which is my sphere, but also in plenty of the other arts as well. It requires you to think about other people. So there's empathy I'm adding in, I'm factoring in. And of course, one word I've missed out, which of course very present in the film you've just seen, is the imagination, is imaginary. Now, a long time ago when the Romantic poets wandered about in the Lake District, as we know, and came across a host of daffodils, they believed that imagination was king. And I'm going to demote the king, I'm going to dethrone him a little bit. It's not that I don't think imagination isn't there, but it's not quite in that sort of elevated role that the Romantics put imagination. For them, imagination was the key, was there. It's important, I'm not going to say it isn't. In imagination, of course, you are figuring images. I mean, that's in that word imagine. You come up with images of yourself in other people's shoes or with other worlds. So you've got also linked with imagination, you have the idea of fantasy and conjuring up things. You know, there's a scene some of you may know from Henry IV Part 1 where I think it's Owen Glendower talks about conjuring up spirits, and Harry Hotspur mocks him for doing it. But there is this idea of conjuring up spirits from the deep, that we can do that when we are involved in being creative. And even thinking of Alessandro Volta, there has to be that leap of the imagination, or think again of DNA. I mean, think about it, in my lifetime, nobody actually knew the mechanism by which we passed on our genetic material when I was a kid. So there's a thought. They knew we did it. You know, there was a monk who stood in a garden in the 19th century, putting pollen on sweet peas, I think it was. And it all worked out. He wrote it all up in a chart and said, look, these characteristics are being passed on, but nobody knew how. And they were puzzled by how it was, and they kept coming up with models. That's what they did. They imagined models, and then along came X-ray crystallography, and suddenly there was a lady called Rosalind Franklin and some others, and they came up with these kind of pipe cleaner models of twisty wires and then them peeling off each other and then meeting up, which is what we do when we make love to each other and all that. Well, not actually then, but you know what I mean. That comes a bit later. Anyway, so, you know, the gay meets meet up and all that, and we share our genes. In fact, I don't share my genes ever. So, you know, those required an act of imagination to get there. So though, you know, the old Romantics and all the rest of it, as Wordsworth says in the poem about the daffodils, and then when he's sitting on when oft upon my couch I lie, then that image that he had of the daffodils that he had when he was out there stays with him. So it's his imagination that he's enjoying, that he can enjoy that. And that's great, but I think it involves these other things as well. And then alongside imagination, when I'm talking to children, I always say, they say to me, well, where do your ideas come from? And I think they sometimes want me to sort of say something like, well, from a jar of water or from a book or something like that. And the answer I give them is, well, some of it is stuff I imagine, and some of it is stuff that I remember. So we have imagination, when then the Romantics left out memory, because the great thing about memory is that it's a huge resource, you know, as we go through life, is that we leave some of it behind, but there's great sort of cellars of it, great roomfuls of memory that sits there. And so quite often I say to children, you may have seen archaeologists or historians on the telly, and they go into the Tower of London or they dig stuff up in the days of Time Team. You know, it was obvious, it was a very popular program. I said, well, that's what I do with my mind. I do a sort of Time Team thing in my mind. I go digging in there until I find something, and then I pull it out and then think about it. So we've got imagination and we've got memory. And then alongside that, we have an aspect of cognition. So cognition is understanding reality. How do we start to understand reality? We use our five senses. So as I say in my answers to children, it's not usually as complex as it is today, you'll be pleased to know, when talking to 5-year-olds. I wonder why when my children ask me a question, they walk out the room. Dad, why is the sky blue? That's a very interesting question. Oh, you've gone. Anyway. So cognition, at the origin of cognition, we have to use our senses, and we use our senses to create. Let's not leave it at the door. Again, if we just say it's imagination, all right, we tend to leave this very mundane thing of smelling, tasting, touching, seeing, hearing, feeling, all that stuff. We tend to leave it at the door. But there is that basic sort of sensory stuff that is crucial to us. And in fact, it's great creative questions lie behind them. When we get stuck writing, one way or another, we quite often ask ourselves at a given moment in a story, a poem, or, even if you're, whatever it is, making pottery, doing dance, any aspect of it, the questions, what can I see, what can I hear, what can I smell, what can I taste, what can I touch? That those questions of a character or of me in the past are crucial. Then also we can ask, what can I or was I imagining? What can I imagine? And then also, what can I remember? So those are lovely creative questions, in fact, very mundane, but actually very creative questions to apply to any given moment in the creative act. Another crucial aspect of creativity that I think is a real goer for me is that when we're being creative, quite a lot of the time we're making analogies. We're saying this is like that. So of course, embedded in literature, as you'll all know, there's a thing called a metaphor, a simile, and personification. Those are all acts of saying, if I say this glass is like a telescope, this decanter is like a telescope, then I'm immediately making an analogy between that and a telescope from my experience. There isn't a telescope here, so in order to understand that decanter, I'm saying it's like that. And then if I then said, I pour the telescope into my glass, then I'm using it as a metaphor. And of course, people think, science isn't like that. Well, not at all. It absolutely is like that. Science is riddled and embedded with metaphor. So we talk about electric current. Is electricity a current? No. It's just something that when they discovered or invented, whichever it is, you decide, electricity, and it found that when you sort of put some sort of charge at this end and then a light bulb lit up over here, the only way at that point they could think of that was that it must be like water flowing from there to there. So they called it an electric current, but that's a metaphor. Okay, so here's this highly analytic statement, electric current. Right, so we better divide that into ohms and watts and volts and all that sort of stuff, and that expresses different things to do with the current. But in actual fact, it isn't a current anyway. All right, so we've now discovered that electricity is something else. They don't actually fully know what it is, but never mind. But it's about electrons leaping from atom to atom. But it's certainly not a current in our sense that it is like water, which is chunks of material moving along. So there's an interesting thing. So we're constantly making analogies, and this is very powerful in our creative acts. Let's say also when we're doing something like reading. So when we make creative acts as we read, then one of the most creative things we do as we read, if I can say there is a form of creative reading, it is when I read something and then say that's like something I did in my life, or something else that I've read somewhere else. So I brought this book, which I think is a work of complete and utter genius. Some of you may know it. It's Clown by Quentin Blake, and it has no words in it. So that's one of the great brilliant things about it. So I'm saying that as a wordsmith. So it's one of the most generative, creative books that I know, because if you sit 2 or 3 children around it, they can hardly stop themselves explaining it to each other. And that seems to me just exactly some of the things that I'm talking about here. It involves empathy, it involves them making these analogies. It involves them thinking about stuff in their own lives, thinking about stuff in other stories. And in fact, I teach a course at Goldsmiths, University of London, called Children's Literature in Action, and the students, who are mostly teachers, take books into classrooms and observe what children do. And just this last term, one of my students, I don't think she'll mind me saying, Mary took this book into her classroom of 6-year-olds, I think they were, 6-year-olds, and just gave them the book and asked them to talk, and she recorded the conversations they had. And it's wonderful because you can hear them interpreting and putting themselves in the shoes of the people, guessing what's going on, imagining what's going on, empathizing with the different characters. And there's a crucial bit of, yes, here it is. I wish I had a slide of it, but anyway, the girl is on the stairs in the book, and she's pushing a baby, a pram, down the stairs. And this triggered in these 2 or 3 children a set of stories about stairs in their flats and accidents that had happened. Okay, so you hear them one after another. Now, in the traditional English education, that was irrelevant because it's not to do with the text, is it? A text is, after all, a box of eggs, and your job is to take the eggs out. So there's only 6 eggs in the box, so that's the beginning and the end. Have you got the 6 eggs? You've only got 5. Oh, sorry, you only get 40%, hard luck. Well, I've only got 1, miss. Sorry, that's the end. I got 6, very good, you go on, you've passed. So that's the traditional way of dealing with it, but these children were talking about accidents in their flats. They were making analogies. And I think the importance of that is that what you're doing when you do that is you're on the first rung of the ladder towards abstraction. Now, we as teacher enablers standing outside of it might see that what was going on there is they're looking at that girl doing something dodgy and dangerous. They're telling dodgy and dangerous stories. So a category is emerging out of their chat. A category that is emerging which is dangerous steps or dangers in flats or just danger, whatever it is, but a category emerged out of their exchange of stories. And we do that when we write. I remember reading Persephone and the Pomegranate Seeds to my daughter, and she got to the point in the version that I had where Persephone takes pity on Pluto in Hades, in hell, the land of the underworld, land of the dead. And I remember my daughter saying, "What's pity?" So written in is an abstract, right, of a specific situation. And then we talked about it, and then we came up with situations where you feel pity, like when you might feel sorry for, like she had felt sorry for her younger brother when he had fallen over. So there's another example, the way in which around the arts and creativity we play with analogies and we come up with categories, or writers come up with categories. They're in the text, or we find them out just outside the text. And so that kind of creativity often goes on around creative ways of reading when you give us the space to do it. Yeah. So all of this, much of this that I've been talking about, involves investigating and exploring the world. And that's, of course, what you saw in the film, that children were exploring all sorts of things. Fear, space, the meaning of space. I'm sure you could fill in plenty of more things that they were investigating and exploring in that situation. And as I've perhaps already touched on, you know, there's not a lot of investigating and exploring goes on in schools unless we create an environment in which it can flourish. So I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but I would say, so that the next thing I was going to say is that the crucial thing to do, we are in this, have on one hand something incredibly wonderful and advantageous to us when we're in schools and colleges, because we have groups of us. So this opens up the possibility of sharing. I mean, you know, if you're a writer like me, you kind of sit on your own, and it may or may not ever be shared. I mean, your family may be bored stiff, so you go, "Can I read you?" "No, actually not." So, "Well, can I?" No, not. And then you send it off, and you maybe not get a reply. So in the end, you've never shared it with anybody. So this is a common experience for writers or artists. But then in schools, we have just the opposite. We have the possibility of all this stuff being a shared thing. In other words, it can be incredibly fertile because what you produce can then be seen, and then you think, oh, I could do stuff like that. And we watch each other doing stuff and think, oh, I could do that. And anyone of us who've worked creatively with kids will know the power of one child generating ideas to another child, to another child, to another child. I mean, it's a wonderful moment when it happens and they look at each other and go, oh, right, yeah, I could do that. But I'm going to make mine slightly different. And you can see these incremental differences and similarities across a room, going back to my idea of something new, something borrowed, continuity and change. Other people call it invention and imitation. It's all the same theme that goes on in creative situations. But in order to do it, we need an environment in which it can happen. So the challenge for us is, how do we create that environment? Now, the film you've seen was one such environment. The curriculum looked like it was suspended, all right, which is not an easy thing to do, but their schools manage it. They manage it. They managed to put a little tick box thing of points in the national curriculum they're going to hit. That's fine. I'll take my hat off to you for doing it. You know, I've seen reception teachers using bear hunt in about 20 different ways. You know, one minute they're going out exploring, going having a wild time, whooping about, and the next minute they're doing some maths, and the next minute they're doing some biology, and the next minute they're doing something else, choral speaking or whatever, it doesn't matter. And they're ticking off the things, but what they've actually done is sort of suspend the curriculum in order to have a big rave up going on a bear hunt for a day. You know, why not? There's plenty to be found, and also why restrict yourself to the bloody book that Rosen did? You know, why not create 10 other environments, you know, that aren't in the book? It's what I did after all, because it was an American summer camp song and a Brownie song that I adapted. The Brownie song was a lion hunt, and the American song was about going out shooting bears, which I left that bit out. So, and then I added in the snowstorm and the forest and the noises and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, and of course, so it's there as a template. It's another way to be creative, a template for people to act out their own versions of. And I get tweets every day virtually with people saying they're doing it and finding other environments that, you know, I hadn't thought about, and, you know, going through the sandpit and that sort of thing, which is wonderful. So, you know, schools offer us that, but also we have to think, how can we make an environment that enables these things to happen? So in my world, poetry world, you know, the question I've asked, and I worked with a group of teachers for a year at the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education. We did a book called The Year of Poetry, A Year of Poetry. And at the end of it, we decided that what they needed most of all to generate poetry weren't just flip little slick ideas of one thing or another. They had to create a poetry-friendly classroom. That was the most generative. Of course, the origin of that word generative is quite interesting. You know, so the idea that we're going to generate new ideas, give birth to new ideas, that was the most generative thing, was to create a poetry-friendly classroom. So they challenged themselves. If you want to look it up, go to the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education website. I think they've put it up under their poetry. They've got a lot of materials on poetry on their website, web pages, and one of them is about creating a poetry-friendly classroom. But you could then apply it across the board. How could you create a science course that was experimentally friendly? Heaven forbid. What a terrible idea. Or art, or music, or whatever. How could it be creatively friendly? I mean, I know if any of you in music, you'll know that there's quite a tension goes on in music education between those who believe that, you know, you should drill in your scales and make sure that you get all your harmonies right, and those who say, well, you know, if you sit at the piano and go plonk, 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 you actually find out all sorts of things on your own. I'm actually, in fact, finding out something just myself right now. I've enrolled myself on a Yiddish course. Yiddish is a language that many Jews spoke before the Second World War, fewer now, of course. And it's quite a challenge, you know, do I teach myself phonically? Do I do phonics on myself? You've got these more than 30 characters, and you can go B, yeah? And then I go, oh no, that's a bit like phonics. I've written about phonics, haven't I? So do I go B? Do I say the name of the letter, which is bass? Do I go bass B? And then do I draw the letter and go B and hope that it sticks? Or do I find words that have got "b" in them, and do I in fact not start from that end anyway, and start from what I already know, which is I know how to speak Yiddish anyway, a bit anyway, because I did German O-level, so I'm cheating anyway. But then if the letters aren't in English letters, you see, they're in Hebrew letters. So if it says ich hab es gelernt, right, which I know, so do I then work out the letters from there? So I'm experimenting. It's quite a challenge for me, because in one sense, because I did Latin and that sort of thing, I'm dragged towards phonics. And on the other hand, with my experimental hat on, I'm being dragged towards play. Do I play? And what I did yesterday was I made myself some flashcards and I cut up the letters. And then I've started, my mum used to call me a schloch. And I'd say, what's a schloch? And she'd say, well, you don't want to know. So I'd say, what is it? Well, she'd say, it's the thing you don't want to be. So I say, oh, right, well, it's not really very helpful, Mum. What is a schloch? So she never explained to me what a schloch is, but now if I find the letters, I can make the word, because there's the sh letter and there's the l letter, which is called lamed, there you go. And then O, you can cheat. You can either put in what's called the silent letter, Stumma Aleph, it's brilliant. It's the silent letter, it's fantastic. Just chuck it in there. Or you can look for something that's vaguely O. And then you've got and of course there's loads of letters, which is, crucial in Yiddish and German. You have to do that all the time, actually. A lot of expectoration. And so there we are. So I've made the word schloch, so it's, anyway, it's like making your own materials, isn't it? Anyway, I tell you what, I'll stop there for the moment. And if people want to raise any questions about the film, there are people here who are responsible for the film, they can answer it, or if you, I can comment on it if you want, or anything to do with what I've just said, or anything indeed that you fancy saying, please be free to do it. I tell you what, why not have a 2-minute break chatting to each other, and all sorts of things might occur to you as you chat to each other, and then we'll do some questions after you've had a little chat with the person next to you. Who you may not know. I mean, if you do, that's nice. If you don't know them, then meet them. The person next to you.
Yes, it's made all the difference. I just wanted to say, I think the exhibition we saw downstairs, and then we saw this film, and then what you talked about, I think this talk of the arts and how it engages with the other is really, really interesting. And so very important, and I don't think other fields let you make that connection so easily. In the film, I mean, when faced with the other, of course the children were scared and they ran away, but then they came back, and then they wanted to talk about themselves to the other, which I think we could use more of in Britain when we have people who've come from outside. It's an opportunity to actually reflect on Britain and talk about Britain and talk about the culture and show it off, or see it from new eyes. And that aspect that we've kind of lost, because I think we don't have that creative spirit running through. So I just wanted to say that all 3 of these things did touch on that. And yeah, that was really empowering to watch.
Great. Let me recommend a book if you're working with little children, younger children. At any rate, The Island by Armin Grieder, Grieder. One of my students worked very hard with The Island. And it was an extraordinary moment. You can see the transcript of the conversations he had. His name is Richard Charlesworth, and you can read this online. There's a book that we've produced, came out this term, called Children's Literature in Action, which is based on these things that I'm saying. And in Richard's class, they talked about it, and they decided that the man in the island was a refugee. And the boy, I think one boy said in his conversation, he said, it's not very real. And they said, well, how do we know? We don't know any refugees. And the boy said, well, I am. And then he became the experienced other. It was quite a key moment in the class, in the conversation, where this boy, who, as it were, had no status, or wrong to say no status, equal status, he suddenly then had high status because he could interpret this book, because he had the power of being a refugee who could then look at this refugee in the book. So that's another thing. So it's the way literature can offer us, if you allow it and give it the space, but suddenly all sorts of people become experts who aren't in the traditional form of an expert about a book or literature, like the teacher or whatever. I'm quite often reminded of, I better not give the example, but my children have been in classes where the teacher has talked about the Holocaust. And indeed, in one of those classes, there was a grandson of one of the most famous Holocaust survivors in this country. And as far as I know, I did cross-check with my son, that the teacher that was never a space for that boy to actually say, my granddad, he's Sir, what's it, who's, quite often on the, but anyway, I just thought, well, how does that happen? How do we have a curriculum where the expertise of the people in the room can't be there, and around the arts and literature, there is that window. So I'm echoing exactly what you say.
Is this on? Yeah. I've got a question about collusional reality. So in the Zerena Project, we created a fiction, and then there's, and it kind of touches on what you've said and what you've just said about the way in which we is the world, like the world is a certain way, and so simply by agreement, the world becomes that way without any experimentation, without any discovery, without any personal, we look from a personal test of reality, if we look at all. And then the way in which imagination and creating new realities impacts what becomes possible in life, in the world, in what, if you speak to anybody, whatever status or society or community they're in, mainly are for each other, the kind of commonality of human goodness, and how we can create something new through the arts, through, you got the sort of, there you go, how about that?
Yes, indeed. Yes. No, I mean, creating other worlds through your imagination and so on, and it enables to make these comparisons. I mean, think of The Handmaid's Tale, think of The Hunger Games. These are wonderful, analogous things, worlds that artists create, but also we can invite young people to do. We can invite young people to make these analogous worlds, dystopias, utopias, fantasies in space or wherever. And of course, always in the end, there's a wonderful poem by the poet Miroslav Holub, who's looking in a test tube. And he's a scientist, he was a microbiologist, but a great, great poet. And the more he looks in the test tube, he says, the more he finds himself. And what he meant by that, I believe, as I understand, is that you can never leave yourself outside of whatever world that you either investigate or create. That you'll always come back to yourself at some point. We say, oh, I must go to Greece, get away from myself. And you get to Greece, and who do you find? Yourself. You're moaning about the sun or the fact that the olive oil is not as nice as it was last year or whatever it is. And so you, in fact, meet yourself, when you get away. I quite like that. So I always think of Miroslav Holub and the test tube looking in microorganisms, and then, oh, who's there? Oh, it's Miroslav Holub. Yeah. Hello.
Hi, Michael. Thanks
Hi.
very much for coming to Milton Keynes to talk to us. It was really interesting to hear you. I sort of have a comment and then a question on the comment. But the comment just relates to what you said there, actually. I was talking to somebody about the archives of Milton Keynes yesterday, and she said that she always looks for aspects of herself within the archive, even though she knows she's not in the archive. It's something that sort of relates to her and her story. And I just thought, when you were you've explained it a bit further there in your last comment, but we create analogies in order to understand similarities with ourselves. And I just wanted to sort of ask you to talk a bit more what you said after that about coming up with categories. And do you mean categories in terms of themes and the themes are what we sort of, channel our thoughts through or organize our thoughts through?
Right.
Is that it?
Well, everyone in this room, we've all had a lot of education, and you'll remember from school, particularly secondary school and university, college, whatever, and then through life, is that you have a variety of words in your head, concepts, abstracts, categories, classes, classifications. We're thrown at it. It's thrown at us all the time, but also we have them. They're built into us. Some people call them schema, some people call them gestalt, but whatever it is, you have these. You can't escape from it as an adult human being. Actually, no matter what education you've had, but if you've had a lot, you've certainly had a lot thrown at you in science and the arts and philosophy and wherever, and history. You could think of hundreds if you just jotted them down on a piece of paper. But the moment you have these generalizations of any sort, they have to require examples, if you like, illustrations before you get to them. And these are analogous things. So just take, I don't know, cliff erosion. There you go. So I'm trying to find something really boring. Cliff erosion. And you'll remember that you learnt that cliffs get eroded by the sea down the bottom, by the wind and the rain, and by frost, for example, or maybe a few plants with their roots and stuff. So you had a concept, erosion, and you had a set of illustrations and examples. And then you said they're similar in the fact that they make the cliff crumble, but they're different because the process is different. Or you may have had seed dispersal, in terms of reproduction and so on. So you had different categories of wind and bird poo and all the rest of it, and you have these different categories. So that's how we go through life. Now, when we're dealing with young children, it's quite often it's interesting. You can hear them feeling their way towards these categories. And one of the great things about creative activity is that actually it helps you find these. You can hear yourself discovering them as you write it, because as you write, or as you're making a pot, or as you're dancing, you're saying, this movement is like, and then you might say it expresses sadness, or it's like that movement of somebody pushing someone away. So that likeness thing runs through it. But in that moment, you're beginning to do what I just did with cliff erosion. You're beginning to do those little lists. And you may not be conscious about it, but it will happen. And it is a form of intelligence. Now, you will hear from the knowledge-rich people is that they despise this or diminish it. And they say, well, you can't do it unless you have the knowledge before you do it. And yet, all my experience, and anybody in the room as well, watching Grace and Perry, watching these people, is that you see people, they're not coming off, I won't use me as an example, but they don't necessarily, the children that I've worked with or whatever, coming with vast bodies of knowledge. They're not going, oh, hang on, I better not write about this until I've read Aristotle. Shit. No, actually, Seneca, come to think of it, because it's a particular kind of tragedy we're talking about here. So I can't really respond to this until I've read both Aristotle and Seneca. So if that's all right, sir, I'm not going to answer this question until I've read that. Thank you. And I certainly can't write anything, until I've read them, because, obviously. And yet others have found that, in fact, experiment, trial and error and so on. And one example I give in terms of the reading side is I was asked to do some poetry workshops with some secondary kids as part of an arts festival, and you sometimes get thrown these things. So I quickly photocopied off some poems, and one poem I photocopied off, you may know it, Langston Hughes, great, wonderful African-American poet from the, partly created the Harlem Renaissance in the States in the 30s and 40s. And he wrote a poem called I Too Sing America. And it's a wonderful poem, artfully simple, about someone, we don't know who he is, and it seems like a man or a young man, and he's excluded from the dining when the visitors come. He has to eat in the kitchen, and you realise he is of colour because he describes himself as the darker brother, and then he says, but next time I'm going to eat with them. So it's full of power, done through modern free verse, so it's very, very slight in it. It's not full of great adjectives and adverbs and all the rest of it. Anyway, so I put this in front of a group of kids. As it happens, I'm pretty sure they were all white, but anyway, I put it in front of them, and I said, talk to each other. I'm going to go and sit over the other side of the room. I'm not going to listen to you. I said, talk to each other about what you think about what this is, what it's about, what it's about. If it reminds you of anything at all that's ever happened to you, then talk about that. And if it reminds you of anything you've ever read, or any song that you've ever heard, or any film, or any telly, and then you can come back and tell me about it. So I was sitting over the other side of the room, and I was earwigging a bit, I admit. And the first thing they got was that it was like them. It was just the same as them. We're teenagers, parents get friends over, and we can't eat with them. It's just the same. It's just sickening. It just makes you sick. You know, you come over, and they get their friends over, you know, and then they eat all this bloody lovely stuff. And they give us fish fingers. So the poem became about them eating fish fingers. So here was this moment, you know, the beginning of civil rights and so on. The poem was about fish fingers. Now, you know, as a teacher, you might instantly want to go, now, excuse me, but can I tell you about civil rights? Can I tell you about, you know, or you could sit on the other side of the room and wait. So they went on talking about their grievances with their parents and so on. And then Darren, it was Darren, stood up and he said, I got this. Hang on. I've got this. This is Martin Luther King. This is I Have a Dream. They all went, is it Darren? Is it? What's that? Look, he says, I am the darker brother. Right? That is like, you remember, Martin, I Have a Dream about the kids going to school with, you know, alongside Joe White. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. And they went, oh, right. So I'm sitting over the other side of the room. I can't hear this. I'm not listening to this, the rest of it. And I said, have you got anything to tell me? And they said, yeah, Darren says it's like Martin. Is it, sir? And I said, I'm not. I don't know. It is. It's, you know, and so on. So there's an example of them forming a category out of a poem. I mean, do have a look at it. It's online. I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes, Hughes. And, you know, I didn't say who Langston Hughes was. I think it may have said I Too Sing America. That phrase, I Too Sing America, doesn't got much leverage with British audiences, because who sings America? Is that the national anthem, or is it, in fact, it's a sort of faint allusion to a Walt Whitman poem about I Sing America, but he's saying I too, a man of colour, sing of America, and so on. But that doesn't matter. So we could do that afterwards. What was important was them to find their way, and then you had a knowledgeable other in terms of Darren. Why Darren? I don't know. Darren's background, but anyway, Darren twigged it. So, you know, thank you, Martin Luther King, for your words to be so universal to have reached Darren. I mean that in all seriousness. And also, of course, it was a text that enabled him to unlock it, and that it was in him, and to, in fact, create a category, that this was about whatever I Have a Dream is about, whatever we want to call it, racism, desire for equality, whatever. But anyway, and there it was in the poem, and there it was in I Have a Dream, and there it was in the room. Yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing moment, amazing moment. I love it. I got this, he said. Just loved that eureka moment. I got this, but also that their route to it was fish fingers. You see, because that's the gut feeling. That was, you know, being excluded. And, you know, of course it's not as serious as what Langston Hughes was saying, but it came from them. So there was exclusion. The category of exclusion was there, albeit in seemingly trivial form about teenagers and fish fingers. But, you know, it was a gripe. It was fair enough. That's the reality of their life. Yeah.
Hi, Michael. This is very simplistic compared to what I've been listening to, because I've gone off on a tangent now. I just want to take you back to you saying, do I sit on the other side of the room and wait? I've been teaching a long time. You can tell by the hair and the wrinkles. Things have gone full circle. You know, I've taught pre-national curriculum, then it came in, everything becomes very rigid. You do this, you do that, you don't do that. And now I think there is hope, because it's about sitting on the other side of the room and waiting. You know, I'm having to relearn to let go, stand back, shut up. And, you know, it's about, like they said, about enabling. You know, it's our job now to enable. But I also think, you know, there are real pockets of hope. I mean, I'm sitting in this room with people that I've worked with, and I was on the floor today. You've really picked me up and inspired me, so I'm going to go raging back into school tomorrow. Whereas at 3:00 today, I might not have gone into school tomorrow, full stop. But Milton Keynes, you'd be surprised, is such a creative place. And I'm inspired by so many people. And I think there is hope. And I think there are pockets. I don't know how we make them bigger, but there is
hope. And in our school, we call those science lessons, we call it tinkering. You know, we enable, provide, there's the stuff, hang back, tinker. The children tinker, we don't. And so I think there is hope, and that's just what I wanted to say. Thank
Great.
you.
And just to be clear, I don't want to put the knowledge-rich curriculum out the door. It's just when, and is there space and time to be creative with it, around it, in relation to it? So I'm not anti-knowledge. I mean, I'm hungry for knowledge all my whole life. So I'm not putting it out the door. So yes, absolutely, yes, lovely. Just Centre for Literacy and Primary Education, English and Media Centre. If you want hopes, go to the Goldsmiths website and find our book, Children's Literature in Education. Children's Literature in Action. So I know it is teachers actually finding and making space in classrooms to talk about books, to act them out, to do artwork with it, and so on, to be creative in different ways. So that's free as well. As I say, have a look at those websites. You'll find lots of examples of teacher-led creativity in the arts curriculum. But science I'm less familiar with, though I did work with the people who are called, I did a book with them. Science, the initials, what are they? CSA, is it? Does anyone know?
BSA.
Yeah?
BSA?
Well, go on, what is it?
Science Association.
No, it's Science in Education. It's oh dear. Anyway, they're very interested in experimental and creative science work. And I did my book, Don't Laugh, Centrally Heated Knickers, which is 100 poems with a science meant to trigger it off. In fact, actually, if you glance inside the cover, I think it tells you, and I worked with them and they produced materials to go with the poems to encourage children to explore science through poetry. And it was called the STAR Project, and that's an acronym of some sort. Oh golly, it's not Science in Education, it's not SIE, but anyway, CSE possibly. Campaign for Science Education, possibly. Anyway, they hold conferences every year. Anyway, have a look, websites. Yeah, very good. Yeah. There's one
Last
over there
question,
with a
is that
microphone.
right?
Yes.
Hello, Michael. I wondered if I could ask for your insight on the type of creativity that is at play when little children invent words for things. So I'm thinking of a specific example, and I think that it was a 4-year-old boy, and he was drawing on his memory, his imagination, his senses, and he was trying to categorize how different people in his family had different preferences when it came to food. So he would say, oh, Mummy's a vegetarian, and Seb, big brother, Seb's a burger-flarian. And I just thought that was a wonderful invention of language. But those words that you spoke about earlier, which of those are happening when a child does that?
Well, it's a classic case of new and borrowed at the same time, isn't it? Because if he says, my big brother is a burger-flarian, then first of all, he's using borrowing the grammar, right? So he's using the grammar of English, right, isn't he? But then he's creating a word, but why has he put an IAN on the end? Because he knows that that's an IAN, that suffix indicates that you're a kind of a person. And then what he's done, if you think of the English language like Lego, right, because we put bits on the beginnings of words, on the ends of words, not as much as other languages, but we do it, right? And then also we have structures, so word order is very important in English. So if you made that, he is a burger-flarian into different Lego bits, you could take out that burger bit and put in pescatarian or vegetarian, so that's one Lego brick. So you can take these out, these are called vertical changes, which are called paradigms, okay? So it could be he, she, is, was, the, right, burger, and any other category there. And what we do when we make English is we do these paradigm shifts, we change them around. that way, syntax, when we change syntax, we do other things. I won't go into that for a minute, but at the time, he was doing a paradigm shift. So what he was doing was creating the new out of the tools of the old. He took the word burger. Why did he take flare? Because of flaming burgers? I don't know. We don't know. You know, the advert about burgers flaring and flaming, I don't know, but he got it. And the maybe the Aryan from the on to vegetarian, so he needed a bit. Where he got the fluff from, we don't know. But anyway, there we are. There's another bit of the paradigm, because you can always change a letter or a letter combination, take out flirt and put in sh or whatever. So you have all these vertical paradigms running through the language, and that's what he was doing, and it's wonderful. And of course, you know, and everybody laughs, and it's great, and everyone's pleased, and he's done something new, and you know, it's lovely. So never leave out the social, you know, because he's done something, and everyone's gone, hey, that's funny, and then of course you go away and you think, oh, I can make up another one. I wonder what I could make up tomorrow. I could make up an ovarian. Oh no, that's already been taken. Anyway, yeah. It's lovely. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Well,
My son, sorry, just remembering, I got into a fight with my then 4-year-old. Well, we used to like wrestling, and I was winning. It's a bit rude, it's awful. Anyway, he got really angry, and he stood over me, and he said, you wait till I'm older than you. And then he had to think of a swear word, right? And he could have used one of mine. You know, you can hear I do swear. I find it quite useful. But he stood over me, and he needed a new one. So he went, you bear poo. And I thought, my genius son. He's invented, I mean, bear poo exists, obviously, but as a swear word, you bear poo, you know, he took the biggest, fiercest creature he knew and the most disgusting thing he knew, married them together and created bear poo. That is my dad. Yes.
thank you.